My name is Kaelvrost. For 143 Terran years, I served the holy ordos of his Inquisition. I have burned worlds. I have sanctioned billions. I have looked into the Imperium's abyss and returned with my soul intact, if not my faith. I am dying now not from the corruption I have fought, but from the weight of time and the cancer of certainty. This record is not meant for immediate dissemination. It is a virus of thought, quarantined until such time as the Imperium itself may be ready to confront its own foundational paradox. Or perhaps it will remain sealed forever, a monument to one old man's final heresy. That choice is no longer mine to make. For 143 years, I was taught, and I taught others a singular, unassailable truth. The God Emperor of mankind sacrificed his corporeal existence to preserve humanity. He sits upon the golden throne in eternal suffering, a martyr deity whose only wish is for his children to survive and thrive. The Imperium's monstrous cruelty is a necessary evil, a holding action against annihilation until such time as he rises again to deliver us. I believed this. Throne help me, I slaughtered entire populations in service of this belief. The Catechism was my armor, my justification, my salvation. Recite with me the foundational teachings of the Adeptus Ministorum, as codified in the Lectitio Divinitatis. The Emperor is the master of mankind by the will of the gods, and master of 1,000,000 worlds by the might of his inexhaustible armies. He is a rotting carcass wrething invisibly with power from the dark age of technology. He is the carrion lord of the Imperium for whom 1,000 souls are sacrificed every day, so that he may never truly die. This is the gospel truth that has sustained humanity for 10 millennia. The Emperor suffers so that we may endure. His agony upon the golden throne is the price he pays to keep the Astronomicon burning, to hold shut the webway breach beneath the Imperial Palace, to maintain the psychic bulwark against the ruinous powers. He is the ultimate martyr, the eternal sentinel, the loving father who gave everything for his children. For 10,000 years, trillions upon trillions have lived, fought, and died in service of this belief. The Imperium's every atrocity, the exterminatus protocols, the servitor lobotomizations, the industrial scale human sacrifice, the grinding, perpetual warfare is justified by the necessity of survival. We are cruel because the universe is crueler. We are monstrous because the alternative is extinction. The Emperor, we are told, weeps for every soul lost, but accepts their sacrifice as the price of humanity's continuation. He did not wish for the Imperium to become this theocratic nightmare. That was the fault of the heresy, of Lorgar's corruption, of Horus's betrayal. The Emperor intended an enlightened, atheistic empire of reason, the imperial truth. But when his grand design shattered at Horus's hand, the Imperium transformed into this grotesque parody of his vision. He endures it because he must, until such prophesied time as he rises again to set things right. This is what I believed. This is what you believe. If you are reading this in my own time, it is a comforting belief because it gives meaning to suffering. It transforms horror into sacrifice, tyranny into necessity, and our monstrous existence into a tragic but temporary condition. It allows us to look upon the corpse starch factories, the penal legions, the child soldiers of the Schola Pergenium, and tell ourselves that this darkness serves the light. But then, in the catacombs beneath Hydrafer's oldest cathedral fortress, during what should have been a routine investigation into suspected genestealer cult activity, I found something that should not exist. The cult was real enough. I purged them with the usual efficiency, but in their profane chapel, hidden behind a false wall that bore the ocula worked in what my auspex identified as pre-imperial bronze, I discovered fragment 0. It was a data crystal of such antiquity that even the Mechanicus adepts I consulted could barely parse its encoding structure. The crystalline lattice was a design from the age of strife, possibly even from the dark age of technology itself, and it contained a partial transcript of a conversation in Proto-Gothic, the linguistic ancestor of the High Gothic we speak today. The speakers were unidentified, but one voice, even rendered in cold text through the crystal's partial decryption bore markers that made my breath catch. The imperious cadence, the layered complexity of meaning embedded in simple words, the psychic resonance that somehow survived 10,000 years of data degradation, a presence that pressed against my mind even through the medium of ancient text. The fragment was 9 words long. They will not understand until they have been broken, context absent, speaker uncertain, meaning ambiguous. And yet, from that single fissure in the edifice of my faith, a terrible architecture began to emerge. I should have destroyed it. By every regulation of the Ordo Hereticus, such an artifact should have been consigned to the flames immediately. Instead, I classified it under my personal seal, locked it in a stasis vault, and began 72 years of investigation that would eventually cost me my career, my certainty, and very nearly my sanity. This record is the result of that investigation. It is not proof. It cannot be. The evidence I have assembled is fragmentary, contradictory in places, drawn from sources that range from the sanctified to the utterly damned. But when synthesized, when viewed as a totality rather than as discrete data points, these fragments suggest a conclusion so monstrous, so cosmically tragic, that I have delayed recording it until the very end of my days. I present it now not as truth, but as an inquiry into the most dangerous question in the Imperium. What if the Emperor's plan was never to save us, but to weaponize us? What if the Imperium's 10,000-year death spiral is not a failure of his design, but its fulfillment? What if we are not his children, but his ammunition? The question itself is blasphemy. To even contemplate it invites execution, and rightly so under the laws I once enforced. But I am beyond the reach of the Ordo now, and if this record survives my passing, then perhaps someone with the courage to think the unthinkable might find in it something useful. Or perhaps it will simply serve as a warning of how far even the faithful can fall when they begin asking why. Let me begin with what should be an uncontroversial observation. The Emperor knew about chaos. Not suspected, not theorized. Knew. This is not speculation but established fact, though it is a fact the ecclesiarchy works tirelessly to obscure. The Grey Knights, the Ordo Malleus's chamber militant, the Imperium's daemon hunters par excellence, were founded during the Horus Heresy by Malchidor, the sigillite acting on the direct orders of the Emperor. According to the fragmented records I obtained from the Titan vaults, at considerable personal risk and the expenditure of favors I spent decades accruing, these warriors were established not after the heresy's outbreak, not in response to the manifest corruption of half the legion's Astartes, but during the initial stages of the war, possibly even before Horus's corruption was made manifest to the wider Imperium. The first Grand Masters were selected from loyalist Astartes who had already proven incorruptible, not through combat testing during the heresy itself, but through criteria established prior to the war. 8 Space Marines, drawn from the very legions that would betray the Emperor, were chosen and remade. The implication is clear. The Emperor knew which legions would fall before they fell. But foresight alone does not constitute the fracture in our faith. The Emperor's prescient capabilities are well documented. If poorly understood, precognition could explain preparation. No, the true discontinuity lies in the gene seed. The Grey Knight's gene seed is unique among all Astartes chapters. It is not derived from any single primarch, but is instead sourced directly from the Emperor himself. This was an engineering feat of staggering complexity, requiring resources, laboratory facilities, biological materials, and vast amounts of time. The process would have demanded the Emperor's direct involvement at a level of detail that seems incompatible with his role as War Master of a galaxy-spanning crusade. The genetic manipulation required to create a stable, replicable gene seed from his own transhuman biology would have taken years, possibly decades of dedicated research. Therefore, the The Emperor must have created the genetic basis for a psychically potent, incorruptible legion of daemon hunters before he was entombed upon the Golden Throne. He did so knowing that daemons, entities the imperial truth declared did not exist. Entities whose very names were forbidden to speak would need to be hunted. He did so knowing his own sons would betray him. Now, cross-reference this preparation with another documented anomaly that should trouble any thinking observer. The Talisman of Seven Hammers. This device, installed by the Emperor's own command beneath the Golden Throne during its construction, is not a safeguard in any conventional sense. It is a planet killer, a last resort mechanism designed to detonate terror itself should the throne fail catastrophically. The Mechanicus records are quite explicit on this point, though they are sealed under Vermilion-level clearance, and I access them only through means I will not detail here. The talisman is not designed to save the Emperor or preserve his works. It is designed to ensure that if his great project fails, nothing remains. Not the palace, not Terra, not the Sol system. Total annihilation as a contingency plan. What manner of loving father, what caring deity, installs a doomsday device beneath his own throne? The orthodox explanation is that this represents a pragmatic acceptance of worst-case scenarios that the Emperor understood if the throne failed completely. The resulting psychic explosion and webway breach would doom Terra anyway, and the talisman merely ensures a clean death rather than demonic corruption. But this explanation fails to account for the mechanism's sophistication. The talisman is not a crude bomb. It is a precisely calibrated psychic weapon, designed not merely to destroy, but to sever Terra from the Imperium entirely in the moment of detonation, creating a warp, dead zone that would persist for millennia. Why would such precision be necessary if the goal was simply to prevent demonic infestation? Why design the weapon to damage the warp itself, unless the true enemy was never the daemons, but something deeper? I set these observations aside for a moment to pursue another line of inquiry, one that had troubled me since my earliest days as an interrogator. The planet Molech has always been an anomaly in the Great Crusades' carefully documented history. It was conquered early, garrisoned heavily, and then largely forgotten by official histories, despite its strategic location. The Emperor himself descended to Molech's surface during the campaign one of the few times. He left the Great Crusades' command structure to personally oversee a single compliance. The official record states he came to install a night house garrison and perform certain unspecified rituals of allegiance. But the resources committed to Molech's defense afterward were wildly disproportionate to its economic or strategic value. 4 full Titan legions, 3 Space Marine chapters in permanent garrison, a naval picket that could have contested a subsector capital. During my 7th decade of investigation, I authorized an excavation on Molech under the pretense of examining archaeotech rumors. What we found beneath the primary hive structure defied every category of known human technology. The ruins were old pre-imperial, certainly, possibly pre-Age of Strife. The architectural style bore no resemblance to standard template construct designs or even to the fragmentary records we possess of Dark Age construction methods. The materials themselves were an impossibility. Stone and metal that registered on our auspexes as simultaneously solid matter and warp stuff, existing in both states at once without collapsing into daemonic corruption. My tech priest examiner, a man named Cyrix, who had served the Mechanicus for 3 centuries and whom I trusted absolutely, spent 6 months analyzing the site before he provided his conclusion. The ruins were not human in origin, but they had been modified by human hands during 2 distinct periods. Once during the Age of Strife, once during M30, the exact time frame of the Emperor's visit. At the center of the ruins, we discovered a portal mechanism. Not a webway gate, I have seen those, studied them, even traversed one under controlled conditions during an earlier investigation. This was something else, something older. The control mechanisms bore inscriptions in a linguistic form that appeared to be a common ancestor of both Proto-Gothic and the Elder Lexicon, suggesting a period of sustained contact between our species that official history insists never occurred at such depth. Cyrix's analysis of the portal's power signature revealed something that made my blood run cold. The mechanism had been activated exactly twice in recorded history. Once during the Age of Strife, approximately M25, once during M30, within a margin of error that placed it exactly concurrent with the Emperor's documented presence on Molech. The implications were staggering, but I needed corroboration from sources the Imperium would consider utterly profane. It took me another decade to arrange the interrogation that would provide the second fragment of evidence, and the arrangements required me to commit acts that would have seen me executed had my superiors discovered them. I captured a Chaos Space Marine, a former Luna Wolf who had walked with Horus himself during the Heresy. His name is irrelevant. I granted him the Emperor's peace after our final session, and whatever sins he committed or truths he told died with him. But before that mercy, I subjected him to chemical interrogation, psychic probing, and finally the excruciation, that terrible process by which an inquisitor tears every memory from a subject's mind, regardless of the damage inflicted. The traitor Marine's testimony was fragmentary, contradictory, stained by 10,000 years of warp exposure and the madness that comes with chaos worship. 90% of what he told me was unusable, the ravings of a damned soul trying to justify his damnation. But there was a core of consistency that ran through his broken narrative, a repeated theme that appeared in various forms across our sessions. He spoke of Horus's pilgrimage to Molech, of how the War Master had descended into those same ruins I had excavated, how he had passed through the portal and emerged changed. The traitor claimed that Horus had not been the first to walk that path, that the portal led to the place where the anathema made his bargain, that Horus had followed his father's footsteps into the domain of the ruinous powers themselves and stolen knowledge and power directly from the Pantheon. When I pressed him on what the Emperor might have stolen or bargained for, the traitor's responses became more coherent, as if he was repeating something he had been told rather than inventing justifications. He said that the power the Emperor wielded, the knowledge that allowed him to create the Primarchs, to understand the webway, to shield his mind from the warp's touch, these were not the products of human evolution or accumulated wisdom. They were stolen goods, taken from the Chaos Gods during the Age of Strife when he had entered their realm and emerged with forbidden knowledge branded into his very soul. The traitor claimed that Horus, in retracing his father's steps, had come to understand the fundamental lie of the imperial truth, that the Emperor had built his entire atheistic philosophy while possessing knowledge stolen from gods he then declared did not exist. I dismissed this initially as the self-serving mythology of the fallen. The need of the damned to believe their betrayal was justified by some greater hypocrisy. But then I considered the evidence I had already gathered. The Grey Knights, created by an emperor who possessed detailed knowledge of demonic corruption, despite preaching that daemons were superstition. The Talisman of Seven Hammers, installed by a father who claimed to love his children but prepared for their annihilation. The portal on Molech, activated during the Emperor's visit, leading somewhere the official histories refused to acknowledge. If we accept that the Emperor entered the Chaos realm and emerged with stolen power and knowledge, then the imperial truth becomes not a philosophy, but a strategic deception. He denied the existence of gods whose very essence he had personally witnessed and exploited. But why? To what end would the Emperor build an entire civilization on a lie he knew would eventually be exposed? The orthodox answer would be that he sought to protect humanity from corruption. That knowledge of chaos is itself corrupting, that the imperial truth was a noble lie meant to shield the species from an unbearable reality. This explanation satisfied me for several years. It allowed me to continue my work, to maintain my faith, even as I accumulated evidence of the Emperor's deceptions. A loving father lies to protect his children. A wise ruler conceals truths too terrible for his subjects to bear. This is not hypocrisy, but pragmatism, not betrayal, but burden-bearing. Then I encountered the third fragment, and the foundation of that comfortable interpretation crumbled. During a raid on a heretic cult operating in the underhives of Necromunda, we discovered a data archive that the tech priest leading the cult claimed to have recovered from a space hulk designated the Blessed Decay. The hulk had been destroyed centuries prior, but this heretic had somehow acquired intact data cores before its cleansing. Among the thousands of corrupted files, we found what appeared to be a fragment of a pre-heresy astropathic communication, its encryption broken by 10,000 years of warp exposure. The message was addressed from Magnus the Red, Primarch of the XV Legion, to my brothers of the Council, a reference that suggests it was intended for multiple Primarchs. The date stamp placed it approximately 2 years before the Council of Nicaea, the great conclave where the Emperor banned the use of psychic powers among the Legion's Astartes. The message was incomplete, but the surviving portions were illuminating in the worst possible way. Magnus wrote of his own investigations into the nature of the Imperium, of discoveries he had made regarding the true history of our creation. He referenced conversations with entities he called the primordial truths, a phrase that made my skin crawl when I realized he was speaking of the chaos gods themselves. But most disturbing was his certainty, repeated multiple times in the fragment, that Father knows what we are becoming, because he designed us to become it. Magnus claimed that the Primarchs' various flaws, the red thirst of the Blood Angels, the savage rage of the Space Wolves, the paranoia of the Alpha Legion, his own uncontrolled curiosity, were not accidents of the scattering or imperfections in the Emperor's design. They were intentional, engineered psychological weaknesses meant to make each Primarch uniquely vulnerable to specific aspects of the warp. The message broke off there, but its implications were devastating. If Magnus was correct and his psychic expertise makes his testimony difficult to dismiss, then the Emperor had created his sons with built-in failure points. He had engineered demigods and then installed within their very nature the seeds of their corruption. Why would any creator do such a thing? The only logical answer is that he intended for some of them to fall. The heresy was not a tragedy the Emperor failed to prevent, but an event he had designed into the fabric of his great crusade. I spent the next 5 years gathering corroborating evidence for this horrifying thesis, and what I found only deepened my certainty. Consider the Emperor's treatment of the Primarchs. He recovered, particularly those who would later turn traitor. When he found Angron on New Syria, the Primarch was dying from the butcher's nails, those brutal psycho-surgical implants that had transformed him into a living weapon of the New Syrian High Riders. The nails were primitive technology, barbaric even by the standards of that backward world. They were killing Angron slowly, flooding his brain with aggression hormones and pain signals that would eventually trigger a massive neural hemorrhage. The Emperor had at his command the most sophisticated medical knowledge in the galaxy. He had created the Primarchs themselves through genetic engineering that bordered on the miraculous. The Mechanicus archives make clear that he personally oversaw the development of the apothecarian discipline, that he understood transhuman neurology at a level no other being could match. Yet, when presented with Angron, he made no attempt to remove the nails. He took the Primarch as he was, knowing the implants were lethal, knowing they would drive Angron into deeper and deeper rage until he became a berserker, incapable of complex thought. And then the Emperor placed this deliberately broken weapon at the head of a legion, the World Eaters, and watched as the nails spread through their ranks, transforming an entire military force into fury-addicted killers. The emperor's apologists claim he lacked the capability to safely remove the nails, but this strains credibility to the breaking point. The same being who could create 20 primarchs from scratch, who could engineer gene seed that transforms humans into angels of death, who could construct the Golden Throne's psychic machinery, could not perform the equivalent of complex neurosurgery on a device created by feral techno-barbarians. The more plausible explanation is that he chose not to remove the nails because Angron's rage served a purpose. He needed a legion of berserkers. He needed warriors so consumed by bloodlust that they would eventually become living conduits for Khorne's power. Or consider Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter. When the Emperor found him on Nostromo, Kurz was already a broken thing, a prophet killer haunted by visions of his own death and the futility of justice. The Emperor, a psychic being of immeasurable power who had walked the warp itself, would have understood immediately that Kurz's prophetic visions were not gifts, but symptoms of a fractured psyche unable to distinguish between possible futures and inevitable fate. The Emperor could have taught Kurz to control his gift, to understand the malleability of prophecy, to find hope in the fact that foresight implies the ability to change what is foreseen. Instead, he affirmed Kurz's darkest interpretations, placed him in command of the Night Lords, and allowed the Legion to devolve into a force of terror and torture. When Kurz's madness became undeniable, when the Night Lords were slaughtering civilians not for compliance, but for the pleasure of watching them die, the Emperor issued censures but never recalled the Legion, never intervened to halt their descent. The pattern repeats with Mortarion. When the Emperor arrived on Barbarous, Mortarion was on the verge of achieving his life's goal, the death of the Overlord who had adopted and tortured him. The Emperor challenged Mortarion to a contest. If the Primarch could slay the Overlord alone, the Emperor would leave him be. If Mortarion failed, he would swear fealty. Mortarion attempted the climb to the Overlord's toxic domain and nearly died in the attempt. The Emperor then ascended the mountain himself, slew the Overlord with contemptuous ease, and claimed Mortarion's oath. This is presented in Imperial history as a demonstration of the Emperor's superiority, a necessary humbling of a proud son. But consider what it actually accomplished. It took a Primarch defined by his resistance to tyranny, his hard-won self-reliance, his hatred of overlords who commanded from above while others suffered below, and demonstrated to him that he would forever be subject to a greater power, that his life's work was meaningless before the Emperor's will. The Emperor did not offer Mortarion mentorship or gradually earn his loyalty. He broke him through demonstration of absolute superiority, and then placed this broken, resentful warrior in command of the Death Guard, knowing that Mortarion's foundational trauma was powerlessness before a tyrant in the sky. Each of these actions, taken individually, can be explained as mistakes, as failures of judgment or understanding. Perhaps the Emperor simply did not comprehend the psychological needs of his sons, despite having created them. Perhaps he was too alien, too far removed from human emotion, to recognize the damage he was inflicting. This was the interpretation I clung to for years, because it allowed me to preserve some vestige of faith. A flawed God is still a God. A father who fails to understand his sons is still a father. But then I discovered the fourth fragment, and this interpretation became untenable. I obtained access through channels I will not detail, and at costs I will not calculate, to one of the Black Library's outer repositories. The Elder are not generous with their knowledge, and the price they extracted for this access was paid in human lives and Imperial secrets. But what I found in those alien archives justified even that terrible cost. Among the Elders' prophetic records, their skeins of possibility, as they call them, I found references to what they term the Anathema's grand equation. The Elder Seers had been watching the Emperor since before the Unification Wars. They had mapped his probabilities, tracked his various possible futures, and they had identified a single constant that appeared across nearly every strand of his timeline. He would create sons. Those sons would betray him, and that betrayal would reshape humanity's relationship with the Imperium in ways that benefited his long-term objectives at catastrophic cost to his short-term empire. The Elder records were fragmentary and wrapped in the infuriating ambiguity their kind favors, but certain conclusions emerged clearly. The seers believed the Emperor had foreseen the heresy not as one possible future, but as a nearly inevitable outcome of his own design choices. They wrote of the 20 mirrors, their term for the Primarchs, and how each mirror was crafted to reflect a specific aspect of human nature, including humanity's capacity for corruption. The Elder concluded that the Emperor had not failed to prevent his son's fall. He had engineered the probability of their fall to an acceptable certainty, while maintaining the appearance of trying to save them. In their estimation, the Emperor needed the heresy to occur, but he could not be seen to cause it deliberately. The betrayal had to appear organic, had to seem like the tragic failure of a father's love, because only then would humanity respond with the specific form of faith he required. Now we reach the question that had driven my investigation from the beginning. Required for what? If the Emperor had truly engineered the heresy, had deliberately broken his own sons and watched them fall to chaos, what possible strategic objective could justify such monstrosity? The Elder records hinted at an answer, but did not articulate it fully. They spoke of the Emperor's poison gift, of how he intended to taint the feast of the youngest god, but they assumed I would understand references to conflicts older than human civilization. I did not, so I sought a fifth fragment, the most dangerous of all, direct testimony from one who had witnessed the Emperor's actions during the heresy itself and survived to draw conclusions. Gaining access to Robot Guilliman after his resurrection was impossible through official channels. An inquisitor, even one of my seniority, does not simply request an audience with the Lord Commander of the Imperium. But I had cultivated contacts over decades, including a senior scribe in the Ultramarines Reclusium who owed me debts I will not specify. Through him, I obtained something almost as valuable as a direct interview: contemporaneous notes from Guilliman's private debriefings with his senior officers, recorded during his first months after awakening. These were not official documents, but personal impressions, the unguarded reactions of a demigod confronting a reality 10,000 years removed from the one he remembered. Guilliman's horror at the modern Imperium is well documented. His disgust at the ecclesiarchy, his rage at the bureaucratic sclerosis of the administratum, his despair at the technological regression overseen by the Mechanicus. These are the public face of his disillusionment. But the private notes revealed something deeper and more disturbing. Guilliman wrote extensively about his meeting with the Emperor, that moment when he stood before the Golden Throne and communed with the being his father had become. The Lord Commander's description of this encounter made clear that what sits upon the throne is no longer the man who had been his father, if indeed that man ever truly existed. Guilliman described the Emperor's consciousness as vast, cold, and utterly alien, as a will of such focused intensity that it seemed to encompass galaxies of calculation and 8 aeons of planning. He wrote that standing in the Emperor's presence felt like standing before a fundamental force of nature that had learned to think but had never learned to care. Most telling was Guilliman's observation about the Emperor's reaction to the state of the Imperium. The Lord Commander had expected to find his father trapped, suffering, desperate for relief or rescue. Instead, what he perceived was something closer to satisfaction. Not happiness. The Emperor has moved beyond such human emotions, but a sense of pieces falling into place, of a machine operating as designed despite appearances of malfunction. Guilliman wrote that he left his audience with the Emperor convinced of two things. First, that the being on the throne is working toward objectives he cannot comprehend and possibly would not approve of if he could. Second, that the Emperor perceives the Imperium's 10,000-year descent into theocratic nightmare not as a failure to be corrected, but as a transformation to be completed. The Lord Commander did not articulate the full implication of his observations, perhaps because he could not bear to, but I will articulate it now. Robot Guilliman had come face to face with his father and realized that the Emperor is not a prisoner of the Golden Throne, not a martyr suffering for humanity's sake, but an active participant in a design so vast and terrible that even his own sons are merely components to be sacrificed when necessary. Guilliman had glimpsed the truth that I had spent 7 decades assembling from fragments. The Emperor is not trying to save the Imperium. He is using it, using all of us. But using us for what? To answer that question, we must turn from history and testimony to theory, to the darkest speculation that my evidence suggests. Let us assemble what we know and what we can reasonably infer. First, the Emperor possesses knowledge of chaos acquired during a personal journey into the warp, during the Age of Strife, knowledge he subsequently denied to all others while building his empire on the lie that daemons and dark gods do not exist. Second, the Emperor created the Primarchs with engineered psychological vulnerabilities that made their corruption by chaos not merely possible, but likely, and he took actions that exacerbated rather than remedied these vulnerabilities. Third, the Emperor prepared for the heresy before it occurred, creating daemon-hunting forces and installing apocalyptic contingencies that only make sense if he foresaw the coming war. Fourth, the Emperor needed the heresy to occur, but could not be seen to cause it, because the nature of humanity's response to that betrayal was central to his design. Fifth, the Emperor views the modern Imperium with all its theocratic horror, its industrial-scale human sacrifice, its perpetual warfare and grinding despair, not as a corruption of his vision, but as a fulfillment of some deeper objective. When we synthesize these fragments, a single, terrible hypothesis emerges. The Emperor's goal was never to save humanity from chaos, but to weaponize humanity against chaos, in a way that requires humanity's suffering as the ammunition. To understand how this might function, we must consider the nature of the chaos gods themselves and their relationship to the immaterium. The ruinous powers feed on emotion. They are sustained by and embody specific aspects of sentient experience: rage for Khorne, despair for Nurgle, ambition for Tiench, excess for Slaanesh. The standard Imperial doctrine holds that we must avoid feeling these emotions intensely to avoid empowering the dark gods. But what if the Emperor understood something more complex, something the ecclesiarchy either does not comprehend or dare not acknowledge? What if the Emperor realized that it is not the existence of emotion that feeds chaos, but the way that emotion flows through the warp? What if he understood that raw, unfiltered emotion, human suffering, without context or meaning, is the purest food for the dark gods? But that same emotion, when channeled through absolute faith, through the psychic lens of worship, directed at an entity in the materium, becomes something else. Not food for chaos, but poison. Nourishment that carries a toxin the chaos gods cannot detect until they have consumed it. Humanity would still suffer, still rage, still despair, still hunger, but all of that pain would be focused through faith in the God Emperor, tainted by his presence in the warp, transformed into something that appears to feed chaos, but actually corrupts them from within. This would explain the otherwise inexplicable architecture of the Imperium. Why does it perpetuate such staggering suffering? Because suffering is the raw material of the war. Why is the Imperial Cult so absolute, so all-consuming, so totalitarian in its demands for faith? Because that faith is the transformation mechanism that weaponizes the suffering. Why does the Emperor not intervene to ease humanity's pain when he clearly possesses the psychic power to influence events from the Golden Throne? because the pain is necessary, and his role is not to alleviate it, but to process it, to taint it with his own essence, his quality, as the anathema, the being whose very nature is antithetical to chaos before it flows into the warp to be consumed by the dark gods. Consider what we know of the Emperor's effect on daemons. He is called the anathema because his presence causes them actual pain. When a daemon encounters the Emperor's power directly, it is not merely repelled or destroyed, it suffers. The lore recovered from the Grey Knight's archives describes daemonic entities shrieking in agony when confronted with even a fraction of the Emperor's essence. This suggests that the Emperor is not simply the opposite of chaos, but is actively toxic to it, that his fundamental nature functions as a poison to the warp's natural order. Now imagine that poison distributed across the emotional landscape of an entire species. Imagine trillions of humans suffering in every conceivable way, dying in war, starving in hive warrens, sacrificing their children to the Imperium's endless hunger, living lives of such grinding brutality that every moment generates the emotions chaos feeds upon. But imagine all of that suffering filtered through absolute faith in the God Emperor, every prayer and catechism and him focusing that pain through the psychic lens of his worship, tainting it with his toxic essence before it flows into the Imperium. The chaos gods would feast on this. How could they not? Humanity numbers in the countless trillions, spread across 1,000,000 worlds, suffering on a scale almost incomprehensible in its magnitude. The emotional energy generated by the Imperium's horror must be orders of magnitude greater than what any other species contributes to the warp. The dark gods would glut themselves on this banquet, never realizing that every mouthful carried poison, that the Emperor's essence was contaminating them through the very mechanism by which they feed. The process would be slow, 10,000 years and counting, because gods operate on timescales beyond mortal comprehension. But it would be inexorable. Entropy at the level of fundamental forces. The chaos gods, in feeding on humanity's faith-tainted suffering, would be slowly transforming themselves into something that can be killed. Or perhaps they would be gradually starved as the poison made it harder and harder for them to metabolize the emotional energy they consume, creating a spiritual equivalent of toxicity-induced malnutrition. This hypothesis would explain why the Emperor needed the heresy. The imperial truth is atheistic. Rationalist philosophy could never generate the absolute faith required to channel human suffering through his psychic lens. Humans might suffer just as much under the imperial truth, but their pain would flow into the warp untainted, unfiltered, feeding chaos in the traditional manner. To create the poison factory he required, the Emperor needed humanity to worship him as a god, but he could not simply declare himself divine. That would have been too obviously a reversal, too transparently a manipulation. The faith had to emerge organically from humanity's own response to trauma. It had to be real, absolute, unquestionable, because only genuine faith generates the psychic resonance required to channel emotional energy. So he engineered the perfect trauma. He created sons who would betray him, who would wound him and force him onto the throne, who would shatter the dream of the Great Crusade and replace it with the nightmare of the Imperium. The heresy had to be terrible enough to traumatize the species, to create the kind of desperate, absolute faith that humanity would cling to across 10,000 years of horror. And the Emperor had to be seen as the ultimate victim, the loving father betrayed by his sons, the martyr who sacrificed everything to protect his children. Only then would humanity's faith in him be absolute enough to serve his purpose. Lorgar understood part of this, which is perhaps why the Emperor came down on Monarchia with such calculated brutality. The word-bearers Primarch had begun worshipping the Emperor as a god decades before the heresy, and his legion had been spreading this faith throughout the worlds they conquered. The Emperor's response was to censure Lorgar with public humiliation, to force the word-bearers to kneel in the ashes of their greatest achievement and watch as the Ultramarines razed the perfect city to rubble. The conventional explanation is that the Emperor was trying to stamp out nascent god worship to preserve the imperial truth. But if the Emperor needed humanity to eventually worship him as a god, why destroy the foundation Lorgar was building? The answer is timing. Lorgar's faith was premature. It emerged before the heresy, before the great betrayal that would traumatize humanity into absolute belief. Faith that arose in a time of triumph during the Great Crusade's expansion would be too shallow, too conditional. It might fade when tested. The Emperor needed faith born from desperation, from the specific trauma of betrayal and loss. So he crushed Lorgar's early attempts and drove the word-bearer into the arms of chaos, knowing that Lorgar's corruption would be one of the key dominoes in the cascade of betrayal. And what of Horus, the War Master, the favored son, the most loyal and capable of all the Primarchs? When Horus was wounded on Davin and hung between life and death, when Erebus and the word-bearers performed their ritual to save him through communion with chaos, where was the Emperor? He was psychically powerful enough to traverse the galaxy in an instant, to intervene in his favorite son's corruption at the moment of its inception. He did not. Horus fell to chaos, and the Emperor's only response was to prepare his defenses, to fortify the imperial palace and wait for the war he knew was coming. When Horus finally reached Terra, when the War Master stood at the walls demanding his father face him, the Emperor's response was not immediate. He waited. He let the siege drag on for weeks. Let millions die on the walls, let Terra burn, until Horus lowered the vengeful spirit's shields in frustration and issued a direct challenge. Only then did the Emperor teleport aboard the flagship with his custodians and his loyal sons. Only then did he confront Horus in that final battle. And when the moment came, when the Emperor stood before his corrupted son, he hesitated. Every account of the duel, from the most sacred imperial histories to the heretical whispers of chaos, agrees on this point. The Emperor held back. He did not strike with his full might until Horus had already delivered the wounds that would force him onto the throne. Some say he hesitated because he still loved his son, still hoped for redemption. But consider the alternative. What if the Emperor held back because he needed to be wounded? What if his entombment upon the golden throne was not a tragic necessity, but the planned outcome? A god cannot die, but he can be transformed. A living emperor, walking among his subjects, could never generate the kind of absolute faith required for his design. But an emperor eternally dying, suffering on a golden throne, sustained only by the sacrifice of psychers, becomes the perfect object of worship, the ultimate martyr, the eternal victim whose suffering gives meaning to all other suffering. The emperor's confrontation with Horus was theater. Not false, the stakes were real. The wounds were real, but orchestrated. He allowed Horus to damage him sufficiently that his entombment became necessary, then destroyed the War Master only after the fatal wound was struck. In doing so, he transformed himself from a secular tyrant into a divine martyr, and he set in motion 10,000 years of suffering that would build the faith-tainted poison he required to wage war on chaos itself. This interpretation makes sense of otherwise incomprehensible details. Why does the Emperor never communicate clearly from the throne? Because ambiguity maintains the faith. If he spoke plainly, if he issued directives that were obviously pragmatic rather than divine, the absolute quality of worship might diminish. His silence allows every faction to see in him what they need to see, to project onto him the perfect God their faith requires. Why does he permit the ecclesiarchy's excesses, the billions burned as heretics, the grotesque accumulation of power in the hands of his priesthood? Because the horror of the Imperium is not a corruption of his design, but its fulfillment. Every atrocity committed in his name generates suffering that, when channeled through faith in him, becomes poison for chaos. Why does he demand 10,000 psychers, sacrificed daily to sustain the golden throne? The official explanation is that he needs their life force to maintain the Astronomicon and hold shut the webway breach. But consider what those psychers represent psychically. Each one is a human who has touched the warp, whose soul is already somewhat open to the Imperium's currents. When they are sacrificed to the Emperor, when they are consumed by his presence, their deaths do not simply provide energy, they serve as a kind of psychic anchor, spreading his influence throughout the warp through 10,000 points of contact every single day. The psyker sacrifice is not merely sustaining the throne, it is steadily increasing the Emperor's presence in the Imperium, expanding the range and intensity of his toxic influence on the Chaos Gods. And what of the Imperial Cult's teachings, the specific doctrines that define humanity's faith? Consider how perfectly they serve the poisoning mechanism. Humanity is taught that suffering is holy, that pain brings one closer to the Emperor, that sacrifice in his name is the highest virtue. These are not the teachings of a faith that seeks to alleviate suffering, but of one designed to sanctify it, to transform suffering into a spiritual good that generates even more intense emotional energy. The faithful do not suffer despite their faith, they suffer because of it, and they consider this a blessing. The Ecclesiarchy's greatest saints are martyrs, those who endured the most horrific deaths while maintaining absolute faith. The Imperium's heroes are not those who end suffering, but those who endure it most magnificently. Every aspect of imperial faith is optimized to generate maximum suffering while channeling that suffering through worship of the Emperor, creating the perfect conditions for the poison factory to operate at maximum efficiency. The modern Imperium is not a corruption of the Emperor's vision. It is the fulfillment of a design so monstrous that even those implementing it cannot comprehend its full scope. Every ecclesiarch who orders a city burned for heresy, every lord commander who sends regiments into certain death, every parent who sends their child to the Schola Progenium or the Astra Militarum, every soul who suffers and dies while crying out to the God Emperor for salvation, they are all ammunition in a war they do not understand. One fought not in the materium, but in the deepest currents of the warp itself. The Emperor is not saving humanity. He is spending humanity, using us up like rounds in a bolt gun, each death, and each moment of suffering another bullet fired into the heart of chaos. But does it work? That is perhaps the most disturbing question of all. I have spent decades trying to answer it, and the evidence is maddeningly ambiguous. The Chaos Gods remain powerful, perhaps more powerful than ever given how they have grown fat on 10 millennia of imperial suffering. But there are anomalies, details that suggest something is changing in the deep warp. Demonic incursions, while more frequent, seem to require more effort to maintain than in the past. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the great warp rift that split the galaxy, might appear to be a victory for chaos, but it could equally be interpreted as a desperate response to some deeper pressure, a thrashing against constraints we cannot perceive. The Emperor's power in the warp has undeniably grown, his saints manifest miracles, his legion of the damned appears at moments of desperate need, and the faith itself has become a psychic force potent enough to harm daemons directly. These could be signs that the poison is working, that 10,000 years of tainted suffering has begun to corrupt the Chaos Gods from within. Or perhaps it is all delusion. Perhaps the Emperor's grand design is simply another form of human arrogance, the belief that we can wage war on fundamental forces of the universe through mere suffering and faith. Perhaps the Chaos Gods laugh as they feed on humanity's pain, and the Emperor's poison is nothing but the desperate self-justification of a tyrant who cannot admit his empire has failed. I do not know. I cannot know. The scale of the conflict, the timescales involved, the fundamental alienness of the entities in question, these place truth beyond the reach of even the most dedicated investigation. But what I do know is this. If the hypothesis I have outlined is correct, then every truth we hold sacred about the Emperor is inverted. He is not a savior, but a strategist so ruthless he makes the chaos gods seem almost benevolent by comparison. They, at least, are honest about what they are. They do not pretend to love those they consume. The Emperor, by contrast, has convinced an entire species to worship him as a loving father while he systematically uses them as weapons in a war that requires their suffering for ammunition. He has built a machine of such exquisite cruelty that even those who operate it believe they are serving the greater good, never realizing they are components to be discarded once their function is complete. And perhaps that is the final, most devastating layer of the design, even if we discovered the truth. Even if every human in the Imperium understood that their suffering is deliberate, that they are bullets, not children, that the God Emperor views them as ammunition rather than beloved subjects, even then, what could they do? The alternative to the Imperium is not freedom, but extinction. The xenos would consume us. Chaos would corrupt us. The Tyranids would devour us. The Emperor's machine, for all its horror, is the only thing standing between humanity and annihilation. So even knowing the truth, we would have no choice but to continue serving, to continue suffering, to continue feeding ourselves into the mechanism. Because the cruelest aspect of the Emperor's design is that it is also the only design that gives humanity any chance of survival. This is why I have sealed this record rather than publishing it, why I have hidden it in a vault that will open only after my death and possibly not even then. The truth is not liberating. It is paralyzing. It transforms meaning into mechanism, faith into function, and hope into simple statistical probability. To know that one is ammunition is to rob sacrifice of its nobility, suffering of its sanctity, and faith of its comfort. The Imperial Cult, for all its horror, gives meaning to the lives of trillions. It transforms the brutality of existence into a comprehensible narrative. We suffer because we are being tested. We die because the Emperor needs us. Our faith will be rewarded in the next life, if not in this one. These are lies, but they are lies that allow people to endure the unendurable. The truth I have uncovered offers no such comfort. It suggests that we suffer because suffering is useful, that we die because death generates the correct emotional frequency, and that our faith will be rewarded only in the sense that it might contribute to a victory we will never witness against enemies we cannot comprehend. This is a truth that serves no purpose except to destroy the psychological architecture that allows people to function. It is a truth that, if widely known, would not inspire rebellion against what? The Emperor, chaos, the universe itself, but would instead create a kind of species-wide paralysis. A recognition that we are trapped in a mechanism so vast that our only choices are to continue feeding it or to cease existing. So I have compiled this record not as a revelation, but as a warning, one meant for a reader who may never exist, who might discover it centuries or millennia after my death, in a future where the context that makes it comprehensible has itself become history. I have spent 143 years in service to the Imperium, and 72 of those years investigating the question at the heart of this record. What if the Emperor wants the Imperium to fall? And my conclusion, tentative and terrible, is that he does not want the Imperium to fall. He wants the Imperium to burn, slowly, agonizingly, for 10,000 years and potentially 10,000 more. He wants it to burn because the burning generates the fuel for a war that can only be fought with suffering as ammunition and faith as the firing mechanism. In my darkest moments, usually in the hours before dawn, when pain and insomnia have stripped away the last pretenses of faith, I find myself wondering about the Emperor's subjective experience. What does he think as he sits upon the golden throne, as 10,000 psychers die screaming to sustain him each day, as he processes the prayers and suffering of a trillion souls? Does he feel satisfaction as his design unfolds across millennia? Does he feel regret, wishing there had been another way, but accepting that there was not? Or has he moved so far beyond human emotion that he experiences nothing but pure calculation, a cosmic optimization algorithm sacrificing pieces to achieve checkmate against opponents who do not even realize the game is being played? I suspect, and this is pure speculation unsupported by evidence, that the Emperor no longer experiences anything we would recognize as thought or emotion. The entity on the throne has transcended humanity so completely that calling him the Emperor is like calling a star a candle. They both emit light, but the comparison obscures more than it reveals. What sits on the throne is a force that was once human, that perhaps retains some memory or echo of humanity, but has long since transformed into something else. A weapon, yes, but also a prison. A tool, but also a tomb. He cannot stop the process he initiated, because stopping would mean the collapse of the Astronomicon, the fall of the Imperium, and the failure of his 10,000-year investment. He is as trapped as we are, locked into the mechanism of his own design, unable to alter course, no matter what regrets or realizations might occasionally flicker through his cosmic consciousness. And this brings me to the question I can neither answer nor escape. Is the Emperor a monster, or is the universe itself monstrous? If his design is real, if he is truly waging this war against chaos through the medium of human suffering, then every atrocity committed in his name serves a purpose beyond our comprehension. The child soldier who dies screaming on a battlefield somewhere in the galactic rim is not simply murdered, but is transformed into a weapon against the fundamental forces of chaos. The hive worker who spends their entire existence in darkness and drudgery is not simply oppressed, but is generating the emotional energy that, properly channeled, becomes poison for the dark gods. This does not make these things good, how could it? But it gives them function, purpose, meaning at a scale that transcends individual suffering. The alternative is that the universe is simply and irreducibly cruel, that suffering has no meaning beyond the immediate experience of pain, that the Emperor's design is delusion or malice, and that we endure these horrors for nothing. Which interpretation is more monstrous? To be ammunition in a war against cosmic evil, or to be victims of purposeless tyranny? I genuinely cannot decide, and I have spent decades considering the question. Perhaps the truth is that there is no meaningful distinction. Perhaps the difference between being sacrificed for a purpose and being murdered without reason matters only to those doing the dying, and even then only if they know which category they fall into. The dead do not care about the meaning we assign to their deaths. Only the living invest in these narratives, these explanations that let us process the magnitude of suffering that the Imperium generates. The Emperor's hypothetical design, this grand strategy of weaponizing human suffering against chaos, is perhaps just another coping mechanism, another way to make the horror bearable by assigning it cosmic significance. And yet, when I review the evidence, I have compiled the fragments of history, the testimony of the damned, the xenos prophecies, the Primarch's private horror. I cannot dismiss the pattern I see emerging. It is too consistent, too comprehensive, too perfectly calibrated to be coincidence. The Emperor's knowledge of chaos before the Imperium's founding, his engineering of the Primarch's vulnerabilities, his apparent foreknowledge of the heresy, his careful cultivation of the conditions that would transform rational philosophy into religious fanaticism, the specific architecture of the Imperial Cult, designed to sanctify suffering rather than alleviate it, Guilliman's perception of the throne-bound emperor as something satisfied rather than anguished. These pieces fit together too well to be random, and they point toward a conclusion I find both intellectually compelling and morally repugnant. If I am right, and I pray to whatever unhearing powers might exist that I am wrong, then the emperor is engaged in what military strategists would call a strategic sacrifice. He has placed humanity in a position of absolute suffering, knowing that This suffering, when channeled through faith in him, becomes toxic to the chaos gods. He is burning us up to poison them, spending human lives and human suffering as ammunition in a war so vast that we cannot even perceive the battlefield. The 10,000 years of imperial history, all the wars and genocides and grinding oppression, are not failures to be corrected, but stages in a process that may require 10,000 more years to complete. We are not waiting for the Emperor to save us. He is waiting for us to suffer enough to generate sufficient faith-tainted emotional energy to complete the poisoning of chaos. And when the process is complete, if it ever is, what then? Does the Emperor expect humanity to survive? Or have we always been an expendable resource, a species-sized munition fired at enemies that threaten something larger than humanity itself? Perhaps the Emperor fights not for us, but for some abstract principle order against chaos. Reality against unreality, and humanity's survival is merely a convenient alignment of interests rather than the actual objective. Perhaps when chaos is defeated or sufficiently weakened, the Emperor's design will move to its next phase, and that phase has no place for the traumatized, fanatical remnant of humanity that the Imperium will have become. I do not know. I have pursued this investigation to the absolute limit of available evidence and logical inference, and I have reached conclusions that appall me. But I cannot prove them, cannot demonstrate their truth with certainty, because the question operates at a scale beyond human verification. I am a single consciousness trying to comprehend a design that spans millennia and encompasses trillions of lives. It is like trying to deduce the function of a machine by examining a single gear. I can see how my piece fits with nearby pieces, but I cannot see the machine's purpose or final form. What I can say with confidence is this: the Emperor knew about chaos and lied about it. He created his sons with deliberate vulnerabilities. He prepared for the heresy before it occurred. He transformed his own martyrdom into the foundation of a faith that sanctifies suffering. And he observes the modern Imperium not with horror, but with something approaching satisfaction. These are facts. Insofar as anything in Warhammer 40,000's Dark Millennium can be called factual, the interpretation I have built upon these facts, that the Emperor is waging war on chaos through the medium of human suffering, is speculation. But it is speculation that accounts for all the evidence I have gathered and resolves contradictions that other interpretations leave unexplained. If you are reading this, then I am dead, and my investigation has become your burden. I do not know what you will do with this knowledge, but I can tell you what I have done. I have continued my duties. I have signed execution orders and sanctioned worlds and sent men and women to their deaths in service of the Emperor, because even suspecting that the Emperor is a monster does not change the necessity of the Imperium. We are trapped, all of us, in a machine that may be a prison, or may be a weapon, or may be both simultaneously. Knowing we are trapped does not free us. It only makes the cage visible. The final question, then, is whether knowledge of the cage makes us more or less human. Does understanding that we are ammunition rob our sacrifices of meaning? Or does it ennoble them by revealing the true scale of the war we fight? Are we victims or weapons, prisoners or soldiers, martyrs or ammunition? The answer may be that we are all of these things simultaneously, and the Emperor's genius, or his monstrosity, lies in creating a system where the categories collapse into meaninglessness. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. We have heard this catechism so many times that it has lost its impact, become mere ritual phrasing. But if the hypothesis I have outlined is correct, then the full horror of this statement becomes clear. There is only war, and we are not its participants but its substance, not its fighters but its fuel. The war is being fought with us rather than by us, and the Emperor is not our commander, but our consumer. This is the terrible beauty of the design, if design it is. It transforms the Imperium's horror into something simultaneously more and less bearable. More bearable because it suggests that our suffering serves a purpose beyond mere survival, that every death and every moment of pain contributes to an objective that might justify the cost. Less bearable, because that objective is pursued with such absolute ruthlessness that it reduces humanity to instrumentality, to tool status, to ammunition. We are not the Emperor's children. We never were. We are his weapons, and weapons are meant to be expended. I end this record where I began it with uncertainty. I have presented evidence and drawn conclusions, but I cannot offer proof. The Emperor's true intentions, if he even possesses intentions in any sense we would recognize, remain beyond mortal comprehension. What I have compiled here may be the most important discovery in 10,000 years of imperial history, or it may be nothing more than the paranoid ravings of an old man whose faith finally shattered under the weight of what he had witnessed and done in its service. But whether my hypothesis is true or false, one fact remains unchanged. In the Imperium of man, in the dark and cruel empire that spans 1,000,000 worlds, suffering continues unabated and accelerating, channeled through faith into purposes we do not understand, serving designs we cannot perceive, sacrificing generations of humanity for objectives that may not even include our survival. And in the end, perhaps that is the only truth that matters. Not whether the Emperor planned it this way, not whether our suffering is ammunition or simple agony, not whether the design serves some greater good or nothing at all. What matters is that the suffering continues, and we continue to endure it, and faith continues to give that suffering meaning even as meaning itself becomes suspect. The investigation is complete. The evidence has been gathered. The hypothesis has been stated. And I, Calvrost, having seen what I have seen and deduced what I have deduced, am left with a single, terrible conviction. In the grim darkness of the far future, the cruelest possibility is not that the Emperor failed. It is that he succeeded in a way we are too human to comprehend, and we are all still burning in the service of his success. This record is sealed. May whoever finds it possess the wisdom to either use it or destroy it. I no longer have the strength to choose.